Mrs. Kate at the Library of Whispers. And today we're going to read some illustrated legends of Scotland's kings and queens from this lovely library book. Kenneth MacAlpin, born 810, died 858, reigned 834 to 858. Before the legend. In ancient times, when Roman legions invaded the country known as Britain, they built a wall to protect themselves from the fierce tribes who lived in the northern parts. They named this wall after Hadrian, their emperor, and the land beyond it was called many different names, including North Britain, Alba, and Caledonia. It took almost 1,000 years before the area north of Hadrian's Wall, the land and the people the Roman Empire couldn't fully conquer, emerged as the country we now call Scotland. In 800, the northern British mainland and islands were occupied by several distinct groups of people, ruled over by their own kings and queens. Some, like the Picts, had lived there for over 1,000 years, since the Iron Age. Others, like the Scots, had arrived later. Their leaders tried to gain more power and territory by conquest and by bringing tribal families together in marriage. Kenneth MacAlpin's mother was a Pictish princess, and his father was king of the Scots. Upon the death of his father, Kenneth became king of the Scots. Years later, around 844, the Pictish lands were devastated by Viking attacks, and their king and all his direct heirs were killed. To his mother, Kenneth had the closest claim to the throne, and so he became king of the Picts and the Scots. Under King Kenneth's command, his armies grew into the strongest force in the land, with the Scots most dominant. Kenneth wanted to unite the tribes north of Hadrian's Wall in order to properly defend the country against invasions. Because of this, Kenneth MacAlpin is commonly known as the first king of Scotland. Many people supported King Kenneth MacAlpin because he and his soldiers protected them from Vikings and other attackers. They also honoured him as their true king because he had been crowned while sitting on the Stone of Destiny. The Stone of Destiny is an oblong block of sandstone significant to Scottish people as a sacred object and an ancient symbol of Scotland's monarchy. It was thought to give those crowned upon it the lawful right to rule Scotland. When Kenneth came to the throne, the Stone of Destiny was in the care of the monks on the little island of Iona. So now we're going to read this short story, King Kenneth and the Stone of Destiny. Viking ships. The guard in the western watchtower bawled the alarm. Fire the beacon, King Kenneth MacAlpin shouted his command. With burning torches, the king's soldiers raced to set alight the huge heap of wood piled on the cliff above the beach. Great tongues of flame leapt high into the sky. Along this stretch of the Scottish mainland, the blaze of the warning signal sent people slower than they usually did. He understood that the boats were full of loot and slaves. The Viking warlords were not coming to attack. They must have already raided somewhere on the Western Isles earlier that day, and by the direction of their course, it had been Iona. The laden fleet swept past, heading north towards their home. Kenneth gave the order for the bell to be rung, letting the people know they were safe. Then, while his soldiers rebuilt the beacon bonfire, he hunkered down on the cliff top to keep watch. It was several hours before Kenneth saw what he was waiting for. In the past, the monks of Iona, who survived Viking raids, sailed to the mainland for shelter and supplies. Now, on the horizon, the king spied a tiny boat, but there was only one, buffeted by wind and waves, a single coracle with a lone figure desperately rowing for the shore. Kenneth himself went down to embrace an old monk who staggered into the sand. "Greetings, brother," said the king. "How fares Iona?" The monk gasped out his news. The frail slaughtered, the fit dragged off to be slaves, goods and livestock stolen, the church ransacked. By the grace of God, he continued, they did not find the box with St. Columba's relics which I have brought with me. Go and eat. Kenneth spoke kindly to the exhausted man, and rest after your ordeal. My king, the monk replied, there is a much bigger, precious item still on the Isle of Iona that should be taken to safekeeping. I have lived long, and I know the language of the Norsemen. I heard them talk about the sacred Stone of Destiny. The Stone of Destiny, Kenneth exclaimed. It has no value in trade. What interest do the Viking warlords have in it? Not content with merely raiding the Western Isles and coastal places, the monk answered him. More and more of them are seizing and settling on our lands. The Viking warlords plan to return in the spring and occupy Iona. From then on, they will use the Stone of Destiny to crown a Viking Jarl, or Drotten, as king over all of us. Kenneth knew it was widely believed that the Stone of Destiny had come from the Holy Land and had mysterious powers. He realised that if the stone was threatened, then so was his plan to forge an extended, safer Scots kingdom. He told a steward to arrange a meal and a bed for the old monk, and called a meeting of the king's high council. King Kenneth's lords, thanes and clan chiefs agreed that the Stone of Destiny must be moved from the vulnerable western coastlands to a secure place in the northeast mainland. We do not want a Norse king, Kenneth's cousin Donald declared. We already have a good king. He set down his drinking horn loudly on the wooden table. A good king, agreed the other council members, shouting and banging their drinking horns. Then began a discussion of how the task could be accomplished. The stone was very heavy. The coracles of the monks were too fragile to transport it. Although stout, the Scottish boats would be an easy target for the faster ships of the Norse Vikings. Our boat decks are so high that even from afar, those Viking pirates would see we had cargo and intercept us. Nigh on 100 Viking ships regularly patrol the western islands and coasts. Our fleet cannot match that number. We could never win a battle against such forces. The boat carrying the Stone of Destiny would be sluggish in the seas special ship, he said, and to avoid attracting attention, it will go alone to Iona and rescue the Stone of Destiny. At this, even his loyal cousin, Donal, protested. My king, he said, the Viking ships are speedier and stronger. That is why we need to build a similar boat for ourselves, replied Kenneth. You will organise our best craftsmen and make a Viking ship, and I, he added quietly to himself, will learn how to sew, for I have some needlework to do. It was a day of bitter cold and freezing fog when a Viking warship slid out of a secret harbour on the Scottish mainland and set sail for Iona. In the dragon prow stood Kenneth MacAlpin, helmeted in full Viking warlord dress. His crew, too, wore armour and weapons captured from Viking prisoners. Unchallenged, they reached Iona and loaded the Stone of Destiny aboard, but they had barely cleared the little island on the homeward journey when a cry from the ship's lookout alerted them to a Viking warship on the horizon. Oars flashing through the waves, the enemy ship was swiftly closing on them. We should alter course for the nearest landfall, said Donal. No, Kenneth stood unflinching in the prow. Do not increase or slow our stroke. Sail steadily onwards. Soon the Viking ship was within hailing distance. Its crew stopped rowing, while the commander cupped his fingers round his mouth and yelled across the gap. Kenneth hesitated and then yelled the same words back. What does that mean? Asked Donal. I do not know. Kenneth smiled grimly. If it is a greeting, then I have returned his greeting. If it is a question, then I have asked him the same. The oars of the Viking warship remained motionless. He is suspicious, Donal whispered. They will try to ram us. We must prepare to fight. King Kenneth reached to his scabbard, but instead of drawing his sword, he pulled a piece of triangular cloth from under his belt, crimson cloth with a motif of a large black bird. Hoist the raven flag. In a moment, the infamous red and black banner of the Viking warlords was fluttering from the Scottish mast. The commander of the approaching warship let out a whoop and thrust his fist in the air. They believe it. They think we are Viking warlords, cried Donal. Kenneth gave a mighty roar and punched his own fist in the air. Laughter from the men on the other vessel echoed over the water. Their oars dipped, and the true Viking ship drew away. That night there was feasting and rejoicing in the king's fortress, for King Kenneth MacAlpin had brought the Stone of Destiny safely to the mainland, thus saving the kingdom and securing the heritage of the Scots. Beyond the legend. Tales about Kenneth MacAlpin say that he took the Stone of Destiny to Scone, near Perth, to keep it safe. Scone became a sacred place of huge importance where Scottish kings and queens were crowned while sitting upon the stone. The stone also became known as the Stone of Scone and is one of Scotland's priceless treasures. The relic box of St. Columba was given into the care of the monks at Dunkeld. King Kenneth MacAlpin also moved his envisage the land of the Scots that would become Scotland. It is from King Kenneth and his family that all Scottish royalty descended. Queen Gruach, born 1015, died 1057, married to King Macbeth 1040 to 1057, before the legend. By the year 1000, different tribal areas of northern Britain were slowly melding together. However, the method of deciding who would be the ruler of these peoples and lands was complicated. Traditional customs meant that it wasn't always the king's or queen's child who would be crowned next. Sometimes it was a brother or nephew, depending on circumstances and the views of the High Council. This led to family fights, brutal murder, battles and war, often with English or Viking armies getting involved to support one side or the other. In 1040, King Duncan I was the first monarch to rule over a wider kingdom of Scots, Picts, Strathclyde and Lothian, which began to be referred to as Scotia or Scotland. To extend his territory even further north, King Duncan invaded the region of Moray, which belonged to his cousin Macbeth. In the battle that followed, Duncan was killed. Macbeth and his wife Gruach were, like Duncan, direct descendants of the royal line of Kenneth MacAlpin. Both their grandfathers had been kings, thus their combined claim to the Scottish throne was so strong that the High Council agreed Macbeth should be crowned as the new king. So now we're going to read Queen Gruach, King Macbeth, and the Ferocious Beast. When Lord Macbeth of Moray was elected King of Scotland, he wanted his wife, Gruach, be crowned queen in her own right. Lady Macbeth is a direct descendant of our first king, and is entitled to rule equally with me, Macbeth told the thanes and clan chiefs of the Scottish High Council. On the morrow morning, at Scone, my wife should sit beside me on the stone of destiny, and be anointed Queen of Scotia while I am crowned your new king. Macduff, the Thane of Fife, pointed to Lady Macbeth, who stood behind her husband's chair, without written proof of her lineage. Your wife has no claim. That we have. Macbeth took a roll of parchment from Gruach and laid it on the table. Most of the councillors nodded. Gruach's ancestry was indeed from the royal MacAlpin family. However, Macduff disagreed. It would be easy for your scribe to create false records. Anyone who wishes to dispute my heritage may read this and challenge me. Gruach spoke meekly, but her eyes glittered. Macduff's face flushed red, for it was known that, like some others there, he could neither read nor write. I do challenge you, Macduff scowled. Your descent may be true, but a ruler needs to be fearless and fierce in combat. As a mere woman, this you can never be. Females are too delicate and nervous to take part even in rough play. He swung his blade over his shoulder. We men must leave now, for the boat hunt is ready to depart. as he went by. "Beware, they will put a spell upon you." Krook ignored him and beckoned the women to come closer. "Go to the kitchens," she said, "and tell them Lady Macbeth sent you to be fed." Then Krook took a purse from her belt and gave it to the women. They thanked her loudly. "Hail the house of Macbeth! Praise to you both, Lord and Lady Macbeth, King and Queen hereafter." As the three women passed her, Krook spoke vehemently. "And remember you are ladies and worthy of your place in this world." The sound of horns and hounds baying caused Krook to switch her gaze to the men and dogs streaming in the direction of the forest where wild boar roamed free. Her chin lifted in a determined tilt. She turned and hurried towards the royal apartments while summoning a stable boy. "Saddle me a Garan pony." The lad hesitated. "At once," insisted Krook. In the forest, the hounds had caught the scent and were sending up a hullabaloo for the hunters to follow their trail. Galloping around thorny bushes and dense undergrowth, Macbeth led the way until finally they arrived at a wide space among the trees where the dogs held the boar at bay against the trunk of an oak. The wild beast was furious at being cornered. It plunged and thrashed, and catching a dog on its thick, sharp tusks, tossed it in the air. Then the boar lowered its huge head to charge. "Thugad, look out!" Macbeth shouted. Men scattered from its path, except for someone in a hooded tunic who dashed forward. "Oh, Macreich!" Macbeth shouted his warning again, for it was clear that this person would be trampled and gored. The slim figure did not falter, but rammed the base of a long hunting spear into the earth, with the tip angled towards the attacking beast, and crouched to hold it fast as the boar, in blind rage, came thundering on. Against the force of its own charge, the beast impaled itself on the spear and crashed to the ground, mortally wounded. There was a roar of awe and admiration from the huntsman. "Approach your king," Macbeth commanded. "Show your face and say your name. For," he added in a quieter voice, "you are either a madman or brave beyond belief." "Brave beyond belief," Macduff cried out, and everyone there echoed his cry. The figure drew back, the tunic hood. "Krook!" Macbeth leapt down from his horse and gathered his wife in his arms. "No man can state that my wife is not fierce and fearless," for Macduff himself called out the words "brave beyond belief." Macbeth declared, "Lady Macbeth will be crowned Queen Gruach of Scotland." And so, at Scone, sitting on the sacred stone of destiny, Gruach was crowned as rightful queen alongside Macbeth. Queen Gruach did not forget that her claim to the throne might have been dismissed because she was female. Neither did she forget the three women begging at the castle gate on the morning before her coronation. During her reign, a law was passed which meant that henceforth daughters were entitled to a share of their family inheritance. Beyond the legend. 500 years after Macbeth and Gruach died, William Shakespeare wrote his famous work Macbeth. His play gives us a very different picture of Gruach, Lady Macbeth, but historical sources tell us that Queen Gruach and King Macbeth were good and wise monarchs assembled an army and marched into Scotland. Macbeth was killed in battle, and Malcolm Canmore was crowned King Malcolm III of Scotland. Before 10 years of Malcolm's reign had passed, something quite momentous happened to Scotland's nearest neighbour. The English king died childless, leaving only a 14-year-old great-nephew as direct heir to his crown. In 1066, a rival claimant, Duke William of Normandy, crossed the Channel, conquered England, and seized the royal throne. William the Conqueror's invasion of England also affected Scotland in an unexpected and romantic way, when a ship carrying a young princess sailed into the Firth of Forth. So this story is Queen Margaret and the Perfect Pearl. When William the Conqueror had himself crowned King of England, King Malcolm III of Scotland offered his protection to the boy who could have inherited the English throne. The young prince sailed to the Scottish court in Dunfermline with his mother and 2 sisters, one of whom was called Margaret. Princess Margaret was a kind and graceful young lady. Her name Margaret means a pearl, and her nature was like her name, for pearls are symbols of generosity and integrity. No wonder then that King Malcolm fell deeply in love with her, and they were soon married. In those days, most people, including royalty and nobles, couldn't read or write. The wealthy had scholars and scribes to do this for them. However, Margaret was well educated, and she was passionate about reading, especially religious texts. Margaret and Malcolm lived at a time before the printing press, when all writing was done by hand on sheets of parchment. This meant that books were rare and extremely expensive. King Malcolm saw that his beloved wife greatly admired books, so he arranged to have her favourite manuscripts bound into a marvellously illustrated volume. The cover was made of fine leather, decorated with gold leaf, and to honour his wife and her name, Malcolm had it studded with a large, perfect freshwater pearl from the River Forth. Margaret treasured her beautiful book and always carried it with her wherever she went. In the evening, Malcolm and Margaret would sit together by the fire in the king's fortress, and she would read to him. King Malcolm adored Margaret and was enthralled by her voice and the power of the language. The Scottish people also adored Margaret, for she tended the sick, served orphans from her own table, and taught local children to read. Although the court resided in Dunfermline, King Malcolm began to conduct more royal business in Edinburgh, which lay on the far side of the River Forth. Malcolm described the growing, bustling town to his wife, and revealed that he was planning a tiny chapel for her at the top of Edinburgh Castle Rock. One day, Margaret decided to travel with him to see the site for herself. The River Forth cuts across the centre of Scotland, separating Dunfermline and Edinburgh, with a broad estuary or firth which flows into the North Sea. Near Dunfermline, the Forth was too wide for a bridge. The only way to cross at that point was to sail over the dangerous tidal water. The weather was blustery, with a heavy, luring sky, when the royal party reached the jetty on the north side of the river. "Why is it so crowded here?" Queen Margaret gestured at the men, women and children lined along the quayside. "Families go to Edinburgh seeking work. Traders bring goods to sell," King Malcolm told her, "and many pilgrims journey to and from the sacred shrines in St. Andrews. To save walking miles to the nearest bridge, these folk are waiting to hire a boatman." Margaret's mind was troubled as she and her husband boarded the royal ferry boat. Their craft was stoutly built, with a proper sail and strong oarsmen to pull through the deadly currents from the North Sea. Yet to her, the various sailing and rowing boats bobbing around on the swirling water seemed fragile and easy prey to the wind or tides. "Come, dear wife, shelter beneath the awning." Malcolm glanced at the gathering grey clouds. "There's a squall blowing in." The Queen shook her head and went to stand in the prow of the boat. The other boats were hurrying to the shore, except for one, which was already midway in the Firth, battling against an ever-increasing wind. "Look!" Margaret pointed in alarm. "That little boat, it's being swept out to sea." The King frowned. "It's taking on water fast. I fear they'll be swamped. There's nothing we can do." "My husband, please," the Queen begged him, "for pity's sake. It is a family. A father and mother are on that boat. Listen. Their babe in the basket is calling out for help." And it was true. The wailing of the infant sounded above the howl of the gale. "Woman," King Malcolm grunted, "the sea is too choppy for us to change course. The oarsmen would be slow to follow my order anyway. You could have us all drowned." But the sailors on the royal ferry boat revered their queen. She nursed their children when they were ill and gave alms to the needy. So even as the king was speaking, the coxswain drummed a signal. The oarsmen bent to their task, and with supreme effort swung the royal ferry boat to face into the teeth of the storm. Minutes passed before they drew alongside the small craft, struggling in the mounting waves. Sweat was running down the father's brow as he desperately sculled his oars. The mother was frantically bailing water whilst the child sobbed in terror. "We have them," Margaret cried in relief. Then suddenly the little boat overturned. The mother and father could swim, but the basket containing the baby floated away. Margaret screamed, "The baby! The baby!" Within seconds, the coxswain had lashed a rope to his waist, dived into the water. Both Margaret and Malcolm gripped the rope as the sailor, floundering, tried to catch the basket. "Heaven help us," implored Margaret. Malcolm barked directions, and with a final surge of effort, the coxswain grabbed the basket and tossed it onto the deck. With no care for her rich garments, Margaret lifted the sodden infant and cradled him on her knee. The mother and father were dragged on board, while Margaret wrapped their child in her velvet cloak, cuddling him close to keep him warm. Clad in dry clothes, the parents huddled under the awning. Margaret gave the baby to his mother, and then the Queen sat quietly until the royal ferry boat docked at the jetty on the Edinburgh side of the river. Onlookers who had witnessed the brave rescue cheered loudly. Queen Margaret stood and raised her hands high in the air. Everyone fell silent. They saw that the Queen was showing them her most precious possession, the ornately bound book with its exquisite cover of fine leather, decorated in gold leaf and studded with a large freshwater pearl. With firm fingers, Margaret grasped the pearl and wrenched it from its setting. She held the perfect jewel aloft and spoke in her clear voice. "This pearl, a bounty from the River Forth, was given to me as a gift. Now I will give back something more valuable to the river and to Scotland. My pearl will be sold to earn money enough to build a sturdy, seaworthy ferry boat. It will securely carry those who wish to travel stories and